All right. I'd like to welcome everybody to this webinar. It's the first one that the National Network on Cuba has done, and we're learning as we go. At this time, I'd like Elaine from the Alliance for Global Justice to please give some technical remarks about that can help you solve some problems if you're not seeing the slides or other aspects of what we're doing. She's part of the technical support team. So here's Elaine.
Hi there. So first off, once you call in, you'll from the same email that you found your PIN number and your call-in number from, you'll see join webinar in small letters underneath that. That'll take you to a new screen where you'll see the slideshow in the back. It's also where you will submit your questions. There's a host chat box in the bottom left corner that you can open. You might be able to submit questions to everybody. We're collecting the questions in the Finally, if you need technical support, press on your keypad, and I will come try to resolve your technical problems. Yeah, and I think.
So before we begin, we're going to hear today from Art Heitzer and Bob Guild, who are both very experienced in the question of travel historically and currently. But I'd like to say a few introductory words about the National Network on Cuba. We're delighted to be hosting this webinar with the collaboration of the Alliance for Global Justice and others. We really appreciate the involvement of Art and Bob, who are not only well-versed and informed about the topic today, but whose organizations are longtime members of the National Network on Cuba. The NNOC has been actively respecting and supporting Cuban sovereignty for over 20 years. We work on issues such as travel, which you can see from this webinar, the freedom for the Cuban Five, which was finally achieved December 17th, 2014, normalization of the relations between the U.S. and Cuba, which we're still working on, the return of Guantanamo territory to Cuba, and legislative issues. We support travel challenges, participate in local, national, and international events and campaigns concerning Cuba, and we'll have more on that at the end of the webinar. We welcome others who share our goals or are curious and want and access our webpage, www.nnOC.info, or see us on Facebook. Our next annual meeting and conference will take place in Chicago on November 19th and 20th. We would really be delighted if all of you could attend and join us at that point. So, as I said earlier, our presenters this evening are Art Heitzer and also Bob Guild. I'm going to be moderating with the help of the three wonderful women, Danielle, Elaine, and Desiree, in the background. We're going to hear from both presenters, basically about 10-minute presentations each, maybe a little bit longer, but I have a ding that will help let them know when time has elapsed. First, we're going to hear from Art Heitzer. Art has practiced civil rights. Hello. Art has practiced civil rights and employment law in Milwaukee, Wisconsin since 1975. He has held leadership roles in the Wisconsin Bar Association and the National Lawyers Guild and has chaired its Cuba subcommittee for more than a decade. Working with the Center for Constitutional Rights, Heitzer, on behalf of the National Lawyers Guild, helped train and establish a network of over 50 lawyers in the United States to assist travelers from the U.S. who had visited or wanted to visit Cuba. He also assisted in the defense of all the trials for travel, approximately 12 administrative prosecutions under the administration of George W. Bush, as well as directly representing dozens of Cuba travelers. This included the Methodist Three, in which the government settled their case with no penalty after Heitzer filed unprecedented counterclaims alleging racial profiling and interference with religious practices. In the past 25 years, he has counseled over 1,000 Cuba travelers, usually pro bono, and continues to do so. So now we're going to hear from Art. Welcome, Art.
Well, thanks so much. Thanks for the NNOC for the invitation as well. And I hope that you can hear me okay. Otherwise, someone let me know. So I'll just begin by saying that my expertise is partly based on legal training and having read some of the regulations and that stuff, and maybe more so from getting all these thousands probably of calls from people as to what they're actually experiencing. So my goal is, and hopefully there's a screen that's going to show you the 12 categories of licensed travel, but I don't see it being projected right now on my screen. The first thing to understand is the difference between what's called a general license and a specific license. Yeah, okay, there we are. The importance is this, that a specific license is what anyone could understand and visualize. It's a piece of paper. You apply for it. It comes with a signature. It comes with a date. It comes with a number. And you can wave it around and show it to some customs or other agent. Not very many people use that because there's also something called a general license. I call it a metaphysical license because you cannot wave it around. You can't show it to anyone. It has no date. It has no signature. It's not applied for. It's out there in the ether. So in order for the U.S. government to maintain the position that everybody needs to be licensed to go to Cuba and spend any money there, etc., they say that you need to be licensed, but most people who go are automatically licensed based on the status of who they are and what they're going to do in Cuba or what they have done in Cuba. So that's the metaphysical license called a general license. So what's happened in recent years is that, as we have advocated for many years, without the Congress changing the 12 categories of licensed travel, they've been, by and large, become broadly defined as general license applicable, which means you go, you come back, you don't have anything to wave in some agent's face, and if there's an issue later on, then you would conceivably be required to justify that you really fulfilled one of the requirements of one of the 12 categories. But you don't have to go through that process of advanced application. So the significant thing that changed with the, in light of the President's visit to Cuba in March of this year, was the first one, the first category you'll see. Full-time people-to-people educational exchanges in Cuba no longer need to be organized by a U.S. organization that sponsors exchanges to promote people-to-people contact. But travelers are expected to keep supportive documentation for 5 years, I believe. So until March, you, if you didn't have special status, you weren't going on a professional research trip as a doctor or lawyer or a nurse or a teacher or something like that. You didn't have relatives there and you didn't fulfill any of the other 12 categories. You could still go as long as you had the money to pay some kind of a tour provider under the guise that this was an educational experience. You were going to meet with some Cuban people and learn from and maybe teach them something by and by. And that was required, however, to be pursuant to a license that a full-time, that a pre-existing organization in the U.S. Sponsored and put together that trip, and they were, as part of their application and review process, required to keep tabs on you while you were in Cuba. So that is what's changed. So now you can keep tabs on yourself. And that probably means that it's unenforceable, but in theory, for 5 years you need to keep records, and they could come back and say, prove to us that you spent at least 40 hours a week being exposed to Cubans on a people-to-people educational exchange. So that's changed it because the travel in the past, some organizations were very nice, some maybe not quite as great, but your local alumni association from a college or university or your art museum, etc., would tend to run fundraisers based on these trips, and they would cost a fair amount of money. National Geographic had some very nice trips for over $5,000 for a week or 10 days, but others went down, Witness for Peace, etc., a little more inexpensive, but still a little bit pricier than going on your own. So there's things to be said for going on a structured trip, especially access to things, or if your Spanish is not in great shape, or your Cuban Spanish is even worse. But now you don't need to do that as a legal thing, and you did need to do that before. And I know people who've been on those trips or have talked to other people on the trips, and they said, but somebody kept track of us all the time, and their friends assumed that means the Cuban authorities did, but it was really the U.S. authorities because that was a requirement of the organization to maintain their license. So that's the first category. Number two is also widely used, especially for people who have a profession like law or medicine or teaching, professional research or attending professional conference meetings in Cuba related to the traveler's profession or their background or area of expertise. That's existed for a long time, as especially the professional research as opposed to the conference option as a general license category. Groups like the Lawyers Guild, Labor Committee have a trip every year and they write a report. You're not required to write a report. You're required to have an intention to share the results of your research. So you have to have a plan to do it even if you don't really do it. Could be a slideshow at your workplace or whatever. Third category is called educational activities in Cuba for U.S. university, college, or secondary school faculty, staff, and students. And Bob probably knows more about this, but there's been some growth for people at the high school level having exchanges, and I think it's reaching down to middle school age for some of the reports I've seen. And there's also been some licensure to allow people to go down to set up those activities, to explore the educational programs, etc. It says faculty and staff can visit Cuba to research and prepare for such student trips. The next one is an interesting one. Religious activity in Cuba by, we put in italics, any U.S. person needs to be full-time, but you don't need to be a traditional religious person. So you don't need to be a Catholic saying you're going to visit the Society of Nuns or whatever it is. You could, we've had a number of questions from people who are atheists and say, I want to check out religion in Cuba and what it's like, and I don't believe in God. Can I do that? And currently the answer would be yes. Humanitarian activities in Cuba, I think this is the, I think the one later on about support for the Cuban people, where there's things get a little bit dicey. But so humanitarian activity in Cuba, I'm not really sure that if you go down and just say you're giving out some clothing or some toiletries or something, almost all of these, I think probably all of them, require a full-time activity. So if you're there for a week, you need to show, if anyone ever asks, that you spent 40 hours a week somehow related to that activity. And by the way, as an aside, there's nothing, to my knowledge, that prevents you from doing other things that are not licensed as long as you do perform licensed activity on a full-time schedule. Participation in public performances, clinics, workshops, exhibitions, and athletic and other competitions. We get a number of requests from people who want to go and watch a sports competition or see a concert or something like that. I think if you're going to Cuba because you're going to be in a dance workshop, I think that's fine. I think if you're going to merely be a participant, you probably are not covered by the general license provision. This is an area I don't much know about. Business visits for exportation and importation of information materials, telecommunications, internet hardware and services, and exportation of agricultural products, as well as sales of tools, equipment, and building materials outside of the state sector. So it's a little bit beyond the topic of the conference as to what those sales are that are allowed. I can comment on that if we decide we want to in the Q&A period. But this allows for travel related to setting up or exploring the potential of such trade, which is then allowed by the Department of Commerce. As I said, I don't have a lot of interaction with business groups going down there, but we can explore that if you want to. Then there's any kind of support for the Cuban people. We said that it's not defined by recognized human rights organizations. That's the 10-minute. Okay, this should work. By recognized human rights organizations. Who recognizes them is unknown to me. It's not stated. Or by individuals or NGOs, non-governmental organizations, for the purpose such as to aid civil society. So this has a couple of alternative forks in the road, and some of them the Cuban authorities are very unhappy with because it talks about establishing civil society, if not explicitly in opposition, in alternative to organized Cuban society. Those of us who have looked at that have said that, well, it's pretty undefined what that would mean, and you don't have to necessarily be against the Cuban Revolution to fulfill some elements of this, but the Cubans have viewed this with askance, and I think Bob knows more about that. Visiting a relative or family member in Cuba, that's the one that's probably been the most used. Cuban Americans, by and large, visiting their relatives in Cuba. It's a general license situation. Under Bush the second, it was very restricted, but it has been pretty wide open for recent years. Visiting a relative or family member. The next one is freelance or other journalist activities. So that's now, I believe, freelance is a general license that was, you need to be a full-time journalist on assignment to be covered by a general license, and to be a freelancer you needed to apply for a license as a specific license situation. And we can imagine with the internet and bloggers and all that, being a freelance journalist is subject to a wide definition, if any definition. Two more, activities by private foundations or research or educational institutes with an established interest in international relations to collect information related to Cuba. That probably won't apply to too many of you. You can look it up, or we can look up the details. I've been involved in various discussions as to what does or does not constitute a private foundation or such an educational institute with established interest in Cuba. The last one is official U.S. government business, visits to Cuba by foreign diplomatic staff residing in the U.S. So unless we have relatives of foreign diplomats on this call, I won't dwell on that. I will tell you that there is a theory that if you help bring your city council president and other people down there, that's covered by this. I don't read that. I think it needs to be U.S. government official, and bringing your Chamber of Commerce or your mayor or whatever does not seem to automatically be covered by that. How are we doing on time, Cheryl?
You've got 2 minutes to 50. Okay, I'm muted.
Okay.
You've got two minutes to 15
okay.
minutes.
So I'm going to be provocative, and then I'll be done. I'm going to ask a question for you all. Whenever you want to answer it, by the time of the end of the seminar, you should try to answer it. So we have a case of, it's not a legal case at this point, hopefully it will never be, a person in Wisconsin who has advanced lung cancer, and he goes to Cuba to get treated. And he's, after 5 years, he still has advanced lung cancer, but he's pretty healthy. And it's because of Cuba's vaccine for it. So the question for you all to ponder is his trip to Cuba, let alone his purchase of the medicine, legal or not legal? So I won't answer that question, but you can all ponder that. I'm done. Thank you.
That was wonderful, Art. Thank you so much. I want to remind people that we really welcome questions, but we need you to type them in. Please submit your questions. There are some people who submitted them via Facebook and via email and other ways. So we have a few questions to start, but if you could please answer Art's question. See if you can do that, type it in. Now we're going to hear from Bob Guild. Bob has been sending groups to Cuba since 1977. He worked with the Venceremos Brigade for many years, and he's currently Vice President of Marazul Charters. So Bob, tell us about Travel Today.
An ever-changing, expanding situation for sure. It changes by the day. I just wanted to add a couple of things to what Art already said about the categories. One is an additional category that hadn't appeared before, and that's the last one that Art mentioned about visiting relatives in Cuba. Of course, we think of it mainly for Cuban Americans traveling down to visit their mothers, fathers, aunts, uncles, whatever. But that category has been expanded so that in a number of the other categories, like professional research or attending conferences, family members, spouses, children, uncles, aunts can travel now with the professional traveling down and can go with them, can go on their own, can do what they want when they're down there, as long as they're staying with the person who's traveling down under the other license. So it's very interesting that you can now do that, and that this allows small children to go, and questions that have come up in the past that haven't allowed people to do that. So that's very good. It is important to note, however, that the one category that doesn't include the ability to visit relatives if you're traveling under this category is the people-to-people category. That is, if you're going down either with an organization or on your own for people-to-people travel, you're not allowed to bring family members as just coming along with you. So that's one. Secondly, on all these categories, it's important to note that these are from the U.S. side. But Cuba, as a sovereign nation, has its own rules about who can come to the country. And you have to follow those rules as well, just as you would if you were going to Canada or France or wherever you were going. And what I particularly would point out on this is, I think most people know that Cuban Americans, if you were born in Cuba, you need other documentation to enter Cuba. If you're a journalist on assignment, you cannot go in with a tourist card. You have to get a press visa. If you're a person traveling on a religious delegation involved in exchange with a Cuban religious organization, you may well need a religious visa. So that's from the Cuban side, and it's very important to note, because otherwise you're violating Cuba's sovereignty simply to arrive with a tourist card, even though you don't belong in that category. So those are things that I wanted to mention. It's also really important to realize that Cuba is still the only country in the world where the United States has restrictions on travel. That is, that you need the government's permission, albeit now, as Art explained, under a general license. But it's still a category that the government allows. It's not viewed as your right to go there. So that the challenges that are done by the Pastors for Peace Caravan and the Venceremos Brigade are extremely important to make the point that we want all the restrictions lifted and gone away. So those organizations are en route to Cuba now, so it's important to support them. The changes that are taking place with Cuba, as you probably know, there are hundreds of thousands of Americans traveling to Cuba now. The majority are still Cuban Americans, but that will change, and at some point the people who are traveling down for other reasons will outweigh the people who are going down to visit relatives. And there are 2 million people from other countries visiting Cuba, and that figure is up as well. So that we're looking this year to have somewhere in the neighborhood of 3 to 3.5 million people visiting Cuba. Not an isolated country at all from that standpoint. And there's new things happening every day in terms of the ability to go there. You may have read that just a few days ago, the United States authorized commercial flights to begin flying to Havana from various U.S. cities. They had previously authorized flights from U.S. cities to other than Havana, to Santa Clara, Cienfuegos, Santiago, wherever. Now there are dozens of flights that have been authorized, in some cases tentatively, in other cases from the U.S. side, authorized to travel. American Airlines announced that it's beginning service September 7th, and they are offering extraordinarily good fares. I think American's fare from Miami is $262 round trip for September and the beginning of October. And they're also offering the same fare to go on a connecting flight from New York to Miami to Havana. Unbelievable fares. But I would just add a little note that Cuba hasn't approved those routes yet. In all the cases of the authorizations, it's one-sided. So far it has come from the Department of Transportation in the United States and not from the Cuba side. And Cuba has issues of its own in terms of thousands of Cubans who are going to come to the United States to visit relatives here. And that has to be resolved in conjunction with negotiations going on between the U.S. carriers and Cuba. So it's not all settled. We're in a transition period between all charter flights to Cuba and a time when there will be a majority of people traveling by commercial airline to Cuba and charter flights being a supplementary service. The charter flights will continue, but they are waiting to find out, including Marazul's own flights, we are waiting to find out what happens with the commercial carriers. What are the final number of flights that are actually going to take place from the United States to Cuba so that we can decide if there needs to be supplementary service to Santiago, for instance, or to Havana if there's not enough flights. There was not as many as we thought that would be authorized by the U.S. And on the other side of that, of course, as I mentioned, Cuba has to authorize the flights as well and determine what the actual schedules would be. And then we have to find out what costs are going to be. Cuba is going to lower its landing fees, which have been very high over all these years, and they are going to lower them substantially. But that does not mean that American Airlines or United or JetBlue or Delta or any of the other carriers are going to drastically reduce them. Right now it seems like they will. But as the season goes on and as the planes fill, we'll see, and we'll have to find out what it's going to turn out to be in terms of the cost going on. We don't actually know when they're going to start. As I mentioned, September 7th, it looked good, but Cuba has to approve it as well. And none of the Havana flights are actually definitively authorized yet. They're going to wait till later in the summer to do so, and only then can flights directly to Havana be authorized by the U.S., and negotiations happen with Cuba to find out what slots they can have, where they're actually going to land at the Havana airport. There are 4 different terminals there, and they have to work all of that out. So transition period, that's what it's looking like. The other factor with the number of flights going to Cuba is where is everybody going to stay? As I think everybody knows, the situation with accommodations in Cuba, they're overwhelmed with the demand. This past season, hotels in Cuba, in Havana in particular, were filled, particularly at the upper end. They were just filled up. There was no place to go. Airbnb is an alternate way to have accommodations. It does not work very well for any groups going down, because you can imagine that having people staying in different homes, if you're a group of 20 or 25, is very difficult. For small groups, it may work out, and the Cuban tour operators with whom we work do negotiate with and do have contracts with a number of private homes for smaller groups, for groups of 8 to 12, for instance, that they can put in homes that will be relatively close by. And this has the great advantage of lowering the costs as well from the hotels, because they, and I think they're taking advantage of a situation that they have not had for all these years in terms of being flooded with visitors. They have raised their costs substantially in Cuba, anywhere from 50 to 100% hotel cost increase for next year. And next year means next season, beginning in October or so, running through June of 2017. And they're depending on the fact that even though with these higher rates, as Art referred to high-end groups going down, that they'll still be recruiting people to go and fill these programs happening, that the Cubans will still be able to fill the hotels. And they are in As you may have also read, even very recently, the Cubans are up against economic challenges going on right now in which they need the hard currency to supplement their gross national income because of cutbacks in Venezuela, problems in other Latin American countries with whom they have big trade arrangements. So there's pressures to keep the cost up. We have pressures on our end to try to work with our friends in Cuba to ensure that people who are not at the high end are able to travel to Cuba and can do so in as economical a way as possible, both with hopefully lower airfares, but also with arrangements that we could find at economy hotels or in private homes or in some other places that we can work out arrangements, guest houses, government guest houses, whatever they may be, that we can use them in addition so that people can still go in groups to Cuba. The last thing I'll mention before, two things I'll mention before I close. One is on the question of group travel versus individual travel. It is very significant that the President opened up individual travel for people-to-people educational exchange. It's very good. On the other hand, it creates pandemonium and chaos in Cuba, which may have been somebody's idea as well, because you have thousands of people traveling to Cuba and going there with a purpose. They want to check out what's happening in Cuba and try to imagine people coming to New York, for instance, or San Francisco, or wherever in the United States from another country, and thinking that they can walk into a health clinic or a hospital or a primary school or a high school and can check it out on their own without invitation, without arrangement. It's not possible to do that. It's disrespectful to do that. It's one thing to go out on the tours around the city, then no problem with that. But if you actually want to find out something about Cuba and the Cuban reality and the achievements and challenges of the Cuban Revolution, then it would be my opinion, at least, that group travel is the way, at least for someone's first time to Cuba, the best thing, the way to do that. There's a reality to Cuba no matter how you get there, but the reality opens up much more when you have access to some of the incredible achievements that Cuba's been able to do over all these years. So I think it's a difficult question because for many of us who see some of the rates for these group programs, it's impossible. But it is possible. Art mentioned Witness for Peace. The Pastors for Peace has some programs that go down that are travel under the general license for people-to-people programs or research, and they go down at lower cost with less expensive accommodations. And anyone can put together a group like that. Only needs 7 or 8 people to do it, and then you can do what you want to do and not rely on just showing up in the city, maybe with a B&B, but not really having a program that will enable you to actually see some of the reality of Cuba. The last thing I'll mention is that a number of us got together last month in Havana, and we decided that it was time, probably past time, to form an association of travel agencies, tour operators, nonprofits, committed to ethical and socially responsible travel to Cuba. There is a lot of unethical, not socially responsible travel going on right now by U.S. organizations, individuals, working with some individuals in Cuba as well. And we want to really try to set ourselves as a commitment to form a new organization, which we have tentatively come up with the name Responsible Ethical Cuba Travel, i.e. Respect, that we will be announcing over the next couple of weeks, not announcing its formation, but soliciting endorsements from the organizations that we know of that are committed to these same ideals. And we think it's very important to do so, to set as an example the way, through the principles that we're going to announce, the way that we think we will be able to travel to Cuba, showing respect for Cuba's sovereignty, for its culture, for its ecology, for its people, that is really important from the standpoint of United States organizations. So I'll leave it at that, and really want people to raise any and all questions that you might have about travel. Thank you.
I'd like to thank, am I on? Thank both of the presenters. And we have quite a number of questions. More questions are welcome, and maybe the responses will also, bring other questions to mind. The first question that I'd like to present would be to Art. Art, how long does it take to get a general license?
You have it. There's no process. You don't apply for it. You just have it. So you decide you want to go to Cuba. You fill out a form, probably, depending on how you're making your travel arrangements, affidavit probably, or sometimes maybe not sworn to, that says you meet one of the 12 categories so that whoever is selling you the ticket is comfortable. Bob will know more about the dynamics and the range of that. And if you're going through Canada or something, you don't really have to fill out that form. But you don't apply for the license. You just are entitled to it, or you're not. So that's what a general license means. So there's no application process. There's no waiting period. It's instantaneous if you fulfill the terms.
Okay, thank you for that. And another one for Art as well. What are the restrictions on traveling to Cuba for research on the Cuba side? Do you need a Cuban sponsor collaborator?
Well, first of all, I will plead ignorance. I'm not an expert on the different Cuban types of visas. So lots of people get the term visa confused. Do you need to get a visa? How do you get a visa? They're applied for a visa. So a visa is issued by a country to allow people who need visas to visit. So Cubans who want to visit the U.S. On whatever basis need a visa, and unless they're defecting, almost all of them are denied. And U.S. people who want to visit Cuba also need a visa, in which almost all cases they get it at the airport, no questions asked, for $25 or $30 right before they get on the plane. But those are tourist visas, so that most people use that. But as Bob mentioned, if you're going to be part of a religious ceremony and preach, then there's a different Cuban visa for that. If you're going to be a journalist, although I think Colin O'Connor, didn't apply for that, to my knowledge, but because he said he just went on a whim a year or so ago. But the Cubans do expect that you would have a journalistic visa. So they have categories now for researchers, academic. I don't know the answer. To fulfill the requirement on the U.S. side to do professional research in your area, that's not been highly defined. It does not necessarily mean you're in a University of Havana library for 6 or 7 hours a day. I've counseled people who are dancers and who are massage people and filmmakers and not to mention lawyers and teachers and all that. First you need a profession. So what is a profession? That's a good question. And then you need to have a full-time schedule of doing research in your profession. And the third category, the third requirement is that you have a plan to share the results of your research with the U.S. audience when you come back. All those terms are not much defined.
Okay, here's a question about the possibility of other topics that we might cover. For example, health, shots, safety, key things to bring, etc. I don't know that, do either of you want to address any of those briefly?
Well, I'd like to see if Bob knows anything he wants to comment on in terms of buying Cuban health insurance, which years ago people didn't much do, and for years now they do it, and sometimes they're surprised. So any comment you have about that and how it works? You know, if you're part of a group, then it comes up in your group application, but if you're going on your own, I don't know when that comes up.
Can I answer that, Cheryl?
Sure, go right ahead, Bob.
Sure. Anyone who travels now, and this has been true for several years, on the direct charter flights from the United States to Cuba, when you buy your charter flight ticket, whether you're traveling individually or in a group or whatever, the charter flight ticket includes Cuban medical insurance, because Cuba requires that any person who comes to the country, whether you're from Canada or the U.S. or Mexico or wherever, has to have insurance. If you have a good insurance plan, like Canada, then your Canadian health insurance actually covers you when you're in Cuba. But it doesn't. The United States insurance companies now, very recently, have the right to work with the Cuban Ministry of Public Health to provide medical insurance, but they have not done so. So the Cubans still require it that you buy the medical insurance when you come into the country. So the charter flights have provided it, and I know that American Airlines is working with Cuba to figure out how they're going to do that for their own flights, and this would apply to all the commercial flights going in. There has been a way in the past for U.S. people who are traveling to Cancun or Nassau to buy insurance when they got to Cuba, and so that has yet to be worked out for the people traveling on commercial flights from the U.S. to Cuba.
Bob, do you have an idea what the rates are?
Well, I think it's the figure that I've heard is that for a 1 week or 10-day program, the Cuban medical insurance may cost anywhere from $20 to $25.
And how long is it good for?
I don't know what the limit is. That was the figure I heard was good for a week or 10 days. Could be up to 21 days, something like that.
Mm-hmm.
Students, when they're in Cuba, U.S. students who go for a semester-long program, get the insurance. They fly down on one of the charter flights. That insurance is good for 30 days. And if they're staying for a whole semester, they have to work out the costs for the additional insurance. I think it's $2 or $3 per day in addition when they stay longer than 30 days.
Here's an interesting question. How do you set up a trip for health professionals that are interested in visiting the Latin American School of Medicine and possibly volunteering there in the future?
That happens all the time. The largest single number of professionals that have visited Cuba in all these years have been health professionals because of the Cuban medical system. And a lot of the groups now in the last several years always want to visit ILAM, the largest medical school in the world. So a group would put in its request through Marasul or any of the agencies that work on these kinds of specialized programs and try to visit ILAM. It would depend on the time of the year, whether the school's in session, whether they're having exams, and whether they can meet with students from the United States, for instance, who are there, students from other countries. Participating in voluntary activity there, I don't think that is certainly not possible right this second. I don't know whether it will be possible in the future. It would be as coming in on a short-term visit. I don't know what you would do to do voluntary work in hospitals. Certainly not done in the United States that I'm aware of. I don't know how it would be done in Cuba.
Okay. There were a couple of questions about sorry if you're getting background noise. Somebody just rode by with them.
Are you back on, Cheryl?
Yeah.
So I come from Harley country, so we have a high tolerance for loud motorcycle noise.
There were a couple of questions about single senior woman traveling in Cuba alone or with another woman. What are your suggestions? There was a question, what's best, hotel or bed and breakfast, even in Havana? And also, is it ethical to use Airbnb to find places to stay? I think that's part of Bob's ethical travel question.
Well, I certainly don't think it's unethical to stay at a B&B or to use Airbnb. The Cuban tour operators are using private homes as a backup to the hotels, or that some groups want to stay in private homes for sure if it's a small group and it can be practically worked out. The question of a woman traveling alone, Cuba is an incredibly safe country, incredibly so, but it would still seem wise to me for any woman traveling anywhere to travel with a companion. And I think that's true of any country in the world, and certainly in the United States not being an exception to that. So that's what my own recommendation would be. And I would also say that if you're traveling to Cuba for the first time, it would still be really good. We have a number of women's programs that travel to Cuba frequently that are members of the NNOC, or they're not. Even the New York Times is sending a women's group to Cuba because they want to find out about the status of women within the Cuban Revolution. And they want to meet with women who are working at workplaces and the women's organizations and at the university and so forth. So it's a fantastic experience, and I would urge a small group to go instead of just one person going down.
Can I do a follow-up question to Bob?
Sure, go ahead.
Occasionally friends of mine who are wheelchair-bound or similarly disabled have asked, well, is Cuba a good place to visit? And I think of all the cobblestones that are missing and holes in the sidewalk where you could fall down, because the PI, personal injury bar there is not nearly as sophisticated as it is in the U.S. So do you have any thoughts about traveling for disabled people? It's not a legal question, but a practical question.
Sure. Even though when a lawyer asks that kind of question, I always try to be more attentive. We've sent a number of disabled people on programs going down, traveling with other people, and we've sent a number of groups of differently abled people to Cuba, working with ACLIFEM, which is the Cuban differently abled organization. So it is certainly possible and encouraging, I think, for people to go there. I think the experience can be really interesting, and I think it's possible. But they do not have. It's a developing country. It's not a. Doesn't have the law the United States has in terms of guaranteeing access, so that some hotels are better than other hotels without stairs, or have wide entrances for wheelchair accessibility. The Cubans are aware of it. They try to help as much as possible. And my own strong advice is that someone should travel with someone else who can assist. The Cubans have been extraordinary in assisting themselves. Anyone who has physical challenges, and they will help. But to travel down, I think it would be very helpful to travel with someone else. And the cobblestones in Old Havana are a good case in point. It can be difficult for anyone traveling on, walking on cobblestones with, and if one is differently abled, it could be more challenging than not.
Okay, getting back to the question of the unsettled, as this questioner presents, a transitional state of flights. There's two questions that are kind of in this area. One is it possible to solidify plans for November travel directly to Santa Clara, given the transitional state of flights? And then also, I hear the airlines had 90 days to set up their travel to Cuba. If the flights aren't approved to land, will these, will the airlines in the U.S. run out of time? will flights be canceled?
Well, as I mentioned, they have to work out a mutual agreement with Cuba in terms of the actual flight schedules and the airports to be used and all of that. And that hasn't happened for any flights yet. But I think it will happen. I don't know the exact date. My own guess is that either September 7th will work, or it perhaps could be a few weeks after that. I think November, yes, I think you will be able to do it. The flights are not in place yet, but they will be. And I think you will. We have several hundred groups that are scheduled between October and June of next year. And some of the groups have already sold out. And we still don't know the definite flight schedules for the flights going in. But everyone feels, the U.S. side, the Cuban side, that they're going to happen. They're being set up as we speak. American Airlines is in Havana right now, today, to try to work out the final schedule. So I think the flights to Santa Clara will be okay in November. I think you can plan on it. It's 99%. So I think it will work. It's just drives us all a little crazy. We're in the travel business waiting for these things to solidify. And if you're traveling down, it'll drive you a little bit crazy too, waiting for the schedules to finally be announced, the costs to be determined, and the exact times of the flights going in and out.
That's certainly hopeful. Here's a question about another mode of travel. What about ferry service? What's happening with that?
It's pretty easy to answer at this point. The United States has approved ferry service from a number of different cities to travel to Cuba. It approved it some months ago. But the Cuban side has not approved it yet. And it's still in negotiations, and I do not have a best guess of when that will happen.
Okay, now we're reminding people to please write your questions. We welcome all questions. And we're getting into some of the more political, actually there's two that are directly related to ethical travel. And that is, what are unethical groups providing travel to Cuba? Or if you don't want to call out specific organizations, which I would appreciate, then what are the things we should be watching out for when evaluating the ethics of an organization coordinating travel? And then related to that is, how can the ugly Americans, in quote, be avoided in Cuba in this new stage?
Anyone who's interested in this area, if they wanted to drop me an email, I will send them. We are finalizing the principles of this Ethical and Socially Responsible Travel Association, and it will actually directly address some of the questions you just asked. And they could drop me an email, which we can give at the end of this. In terms of what to look for, no, I'm not. We're not cops. I'm not going to call out organizations. But what I would look for, what I would ask people about, for instance, is the fact that Cuba requires the U.S. groups that come to Cuba that their arrangements be done by one of the authorized Cuban tour operators. And there are only 3 that are authorized to deal with U.S. groups right now. That would be Havana Tour, Amis Tour, and San Cristobal. Amis Tour is the travel agency of ECAP, the Cuban Friendship Association, with whom the NNOC has friendly relations, and so does Marasul, and probably a number of organizations on this line, including the National Lawyers Guild. So those are the 3 associations that are authorized to set up programs. If the group you're working with says that they're doing it on their own, they have automatically violated Cuban regulations. And therefore, I myself believe that's not right. Who are they to set up their own program if the Cubans are not? They're going to another people's country, And in my view, that country should determine its arrangements for its guests coming to visit. And I would automatically raise an eyebrow about such a thing. There are other institutions in Cuba that do welcome groups. They're not tour operators, but groups like the Martin Luther King Center has wonderful programs. They do some limited groups, mainly religious groups that visit the island. The University of Havana, of course, has student groups that come and they work out semester-long programs. But in general, it is those three associations. That will be expanded soon. There will be other Cuban tour operators who will be added to that list. But I think that's the main criteria that I'm looking for. And I've seen lots of advertisements that are over the web of people who say they're doing it themselves. This is the real way to do people-to-people travel. Don't go through the Cuban government. Don't go through the tour operators. We're setting this stuff up ourselves. I think that's an automatically arrogant point of view in terms of that ugly American image. I don't think the majority of people who go, a vast, vast majority of people who go are ugly Americans. I think people are genuinely curious, genuinely want to see another country, and desire to be respectful in their relationship with Cubans. There are individuals in whatever group that may go down that may cross the line with cultural or an arrogant attitude or to another people. We certainly have people like that in this country, don't we? But on the other hand, I think to travel with respect, to try to realize that you're visiting another people's country, another people's home, that you are going to be respectful at. You're going to travel there with every good intention of listening and trying not to bring what we call ideological baggage with you, making assumptions of what another people or another culture or another country is like, and be open to the ideas and the experiences you have. Be open to it, not to be programmed one way or the other, but to go to Cuba with open eyes and to see both the tremendous successes and the tremendous challenges that are in front of Cuba right now.
So if I can follow up with a question to Bob. So let's say you have a family or extended group of 3 people, 5 people, 7 people. They want to go to Cuba. They've never been to Cuba before. What are their options in terms of setting up something where they will have access to, a Cuban school or a Cuban clinic or something like that?
Well, it's a good question, and for all of us, if there are other tour operators on the line in addition to Marasul, any of us are able to work with a group. Usually minimum is somewhere around 7 or 8 people traveling together, who would have a program that they would request to us. We certainly have ideas, having done this for so long, but we want to know what you all want to do when you're there, what kind of exchanges. Maybe there is a doctor or a educator or a lawyer or a student who's in the group, maybe an elementary school student, maybe a musician, maybe a writer, that you want to have exchanges with your counterparts in Cuba, and we're able to set up those kinds of meetings. So that's the idea. Where would you like to stay? What cities would you like to visit while you're in Cuba? It's a huge island. It's not a small pinpoint island like many in the Caribbean. It's 900 miles from one end to the other. So it's a big place. Where do you want to go? What do you want to see? And then I think you have the possibility, even in a relatively short time, a week or 10 days, of experiencing as much of Cuba's reality as is possible in that amount of time. And much more difficult to do as an individual. One of my son-in-laws is from England, and he went to Cuba because he could do so, no restrictions whatsoever, but just as an individual, and just hitchhiked around. And he had a great time. But he didn't see that much in terms of the reality of what Cuban social institutions and Cuban history and politics and culture. Culture he saw quite a bit of every night, but it's not quite the same. So that question is a good one, and we have a lot of families doing exactly what you described, Art.
Thank you.
We have about 25 minutes left in this webinar, and I'd like to remind people how they can ask their questions. On the lower side of one side, I'm looking at a completely different screen. So at the lower side, there's a chat box, and if you type your question in there, lower left, in the lower left chat box, type your question in there. It's a blue chat box. So that's where you can type in your question, and we would be really glad to address it. I have a kind of a question that's from the NNOC, or sounds like it's from someone in the NNOC. How can we as an organized network of people in the United States in solidarity with Cuba influence or work with those who travel to Cuba when they return? How do we reach out to those people?
It's just an excellent question, and I think we've all been thinking about it for a long time, because the NNOC and the organizations within it are trying, but so far it's been challenging to reach out to the tens of thousands, literally, of people going to Cuba these days, whether they're just going on the boat rides that go in and they don't spend much time in Cuba, but at least they're visiting the place, or the student groups that are going, or these people-to-people groups. How do we reach out to them? How do we have an exchange that can take place where we can discuss some of the issues that come up about travel to Cuba? It's not always, even though you go to the country, you visit with people, you have an incredible experience, maybe the experience of a lifetime, but you come back and you might have all these questions about what you've seen, and you want to discuss it with other people. So maybe the group does it itself, but maybe if there's a way that the NNOC in various cities might begin to have some kind of meetings or a conference to discuss some of the issues that come up. And obviously some of those are all of them are related to the politics of the situation. That is, the embargo is still on. The economic blockade is still there. The travel restrictions are still on. Even though there was supposed to be a vote in Congress this past week, it was put off. They withdrew the resolutions. So those are big issues behind everything going on right now. But there are other issues about what's happening in Cuba. Is it transitioning to capitalism? What is the basis for how Cuba is going to move forward? What do the Cubans think about it? What about race in Cuba? It's been a big topic of discussion in the press up here and among people who travel to Cuba. Maybe the NNOC needs to have discussions that would specifically reach out to people who've been to Cuba, what their experiences were, what their intentions are, what if they're going to Cuba. And some of the the biggest groups that have been going lately have been, for instance, African-American groups traveling to Cuba to study Afro-Cuban religion, Afro-Cuban experiences in the fight against racism. Really interesting discussions could be had on that, on LGBTQ rights, on both the history in Cuba, a challenging, difficult history, and tremendous advances that have been made in fighting for those rights. Where does it stand now? What is the relationship between the communities in the United States and the communities in Cuba? What about civil society? The United States always talks about purposeful travel, a concept that I have never believed in. I don't believe that if you want to go to the beach in Cuba and hang out there for 2 weeks, I believe that's purposeful travel. And what the State Department usually has in mind is purposeful travel has to be for the purpose of changing the Cuban social system. So I think that's a good discussion. Let's talk about civil society in Cuba. So many people are visiting there. What was their impression? What did they think? What are some good exchanges we could have about it? And how is it related to the programs that still continue to this day, run by the United States government? Even in this period of supposed normalizing relations, we run programs that give money to dissidents in Cuba to change their social system. If that was happening going in the other direction to the United States would outlaw it, would prosecute and persecute people who were taking that kind of money. So all those are discussions that I think are ways that we might be able to involve people who have just traveled to Cuba.
So let me pipe in. So
Go ahead.
My experience on a local level, I mean, there's a number of groups. We know who the groups are. It's not been very easy to get them, the participants, to relate much to our activity. Our coalition is not, at least formally, a Cuba Solidarity group. It's to normalize relations with Cuba. You would think it would be kind of milquetoasty, but to my surprise and concern, I guess, a bit, not everybody and maybe not most people who come back from Cuba today are terribly interested in, connecting with, going to meetings, etc., or programs related to Cuba. My thought while we were just discussing this right now is maybe it exists, but maybe someone should create a Facebook group of just called U.S. returnees from Cuba, or whatever you want to call it. Keep it, obviously there's a challenge in who's going to take it over and how much time we're going to be dealing with haranguing people or being harangued. But there should be some more open, non-committal kind of forum where people can exchange their impressions. That's very inviting, and I think there's opportunity there, but I don't think they've been realized to the degree they should be. Anybody there?
I am.
Good.
Me too. Can you hear me?
I can hear
Yes.
you.
Okay, good.
I also threw out a question that no one has answered yet, by the way.
What question was that?
It was,
Oh, absolutely.
I don't know if we're getting near the point we should start tallying up answers or not.
Yeah, that would be a good thing. You want to re-ask your question, Art?
Yeah, sure. So Bob and I have reviewed the 12 categories of licensed, or you could almost say licensable travel to Cuba. And my question is for our friend not too far outside of Milwaukee who has advanced lung cancer and who's gone to Cuba to be treated and to get the medicine that they have that's effective at dealing with lung cancer, even though it doesn't cure it, but it doesn't allow it to expand much either, whether his travel is legal or not.
Does anybody want to address that question? Please type in your answer in the chat box, the lower left side, the blue box. What do you think about that? Okay, while you're doing that, there's another.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Well, I just wanted to follow up a little bit. I asked if a group of family or whatever, extended couple of families, want to go, how they can get access to Cuban institutions. And Bob gave a generalized answer, which was good. I'm wondering if you want to comment, Bob, in any way on what the cost of that would be. I mean, one is whether Marzul or whoever would organize the whole trip, and the other was that the people are going to go on their own, maybe get their own accommodation. I'm just trying to get some cost impressions when it's not.
It's a very good question, and I wish I could answer it. In years past, I could have given an estimate, but these days it's just impossible to guess for next year of what those kind of costs would look like. It is not possible at this moment in time for someone to set up their own accommodations and have a program provided by Mar Azul or another Cuba travel service provider. It is not possible. The tour operators in Cuba with whom we work require that the accommodations, and that could be at a private home, but that the accommodations be included, because otherwise it's impossible to set up a program picking people up, dropping them off, and so forth. So that's part of it. But trying to figure out what the cost is when the airfare is unknown, when the accommodations is unknown, when the number of people is unknown, whether there are children involved, and the children would be costed at a completely different rate than the adults would be. It's 50% of the cost of adults if you're under 12. So those are factors in it. It would still be an expensive trip, and family vacations I'm pretty familiar with, but nothing in the realm of the 5,000 or something that had been mentioned before. I think maybe somewhere between 1,000 and 2,000 per person for the adults, and something less than that for the children.
We have an answer.
Good.
Beverly Perry says, I feel he has a right to do whatever he can to prolong his quality of life, and it should be permitted. Others are allowed to go to Mexico for other treatments. Why should Cuba be any different? What do you think of that?
Well, do we have any other answers rolling in or not?
Well, there actually is one, and we're not going to be, Desiree, where is it? Okay. No, it is illegal. That's the answer to the question.
I think that's the right answer. I mean, Bob might have a different view, but and as you may know, medical tourism is kind of a big market in some places. And Cuba, years ago had at least one, a half-an-hour videotape advertising medical tourism. So it's important. It's not negligible. In this case, it's maybe one guy. But I don't see any of the 12 categories. I mean, maybe, you could say humanitarian because it keeps him alive, but I don't think that's the way it's written.
Well, Art, I would, if I was asked on the phone by a person who is going down to do that, yeah, I would refer to the individual people-to-people educational exchange travel and say it would seem to me logical to assume that person traveling down to get treatment in Cuba would be engaged in meaningful exchange with a Cuban every day that they're there, and therefore they fulfill that category, and that's it.
Okay, so that's a way around it. Yeah. I mean, I agree with you on that. If push comes to shove and they say the only reason I went down was to get medical treatment, and I don't speak Spanish, and they didn't speak English much, and I didn't bother to do anything other than get my treatment, and that's the way they want to phrase it, I think it doesn't fit, which goes back to that, although they've vastly expanded what these categories mean, tourism, of course, defined per se as the word tourism, is still illegal without congressional action. But this is a good example of something that's not really tourism, and no one could really object to somebody doing this to keep himself alive. But he's not allowed, I think, the way it's written, unless you get around some other aspect of it, which, a creative person can probably do.
Okay, well, we're starting now to wind down to the end, and there was somebody who asked if it was going to be possible to send the names of the groups mentioned to coordinate travel, and actually that goes into what I was thinking also, that after the webinar, we'd like to poll the people who participated to get your reactions and how we could improve it and all of that, and also ask if they would be interested in taking up some of the topics that were mentioned by Bob about issues related to travel, if that might be a means of doing it if people wanted to do that. So, yeah, we do plan on sending out information, figuring out, I think this whole event was recorded, so we can send all that information out to people. We will definitely look into it, but yes. A couple more questions. Is the Office of Foreign Asset Control still issuing licenses for travel service providers? If so, what's required for these?
The Office of Foreign Assets Control does still exist, of course, and it is still issuing specific licenses, and this is somewhat related to what Art had just mentioned. In the past, there have been people who have traveled to Cuba for medical treatment, and they have required, according to OFAC, a specific license in order to do that. And so OFAC would issue, if they were going to do it, they did issue a license. In the case of travel service providers, it is no longer necessary for any travel service provider, whether they be a travel agency or a social institution, to get a license from the Treasury Department. Travel agencies, tour operators, social institutions can travel under general license, can organize a trip under the general license, and are not required to be licensed by OFAC anymore.
Oh, well, Bob, I'm going to recalibrate that a bit. My understanding is that TSPs still need to be licensed. It's just a general license, so there's no application process, and the stringency of what was required has been relaxed, but the requirement to fulfill some obligations and to keep records of that for years is still on the books.
It's somewhat similar to the requirement that people-to-people organizations that send groups down. That is, Mar Azul is required to keep records for 5 years of an individual who travels to Cuba, the financial payments that are made to us, and the certification statement that says that they're traveling under one of the 12 categories or under a specific license. And those are the only requirements that we have now. We are not required to vet anyone who's traveling down or to collect any additional information. At one time or another, we had to collect resumes from people who were traveling down to do research in Cuba. No more. Now it is only necessary to collect a piece of paper that says, I'm traveling in one of these 12 categories.
Does anyone know yet how much scrutiny is being given over compliance to the new 12 categories? Art, has anybody been questioned or asked to provide documentation?
As a general rule, the last 2 years of Bush, so that's 2006, November, end of 2006, to the present, there has been generally no enforcement against individual travelers. And the more we're in a general license regime, the more difficult any enforcement really could be. You'd have to hire an army of people to try and track everybody down and ask for their records for 2 years ago. So overall, generally none in terms of enforcement, and that's not new. That's been true when the Democrats won the off-year election in 2006. There are exceptions. One exception is a person I represent named Albert Fox in Florida, who's in the spring of last year, I guess, was assessed a $100,000 fine for having gone 4 and 5 years ago, and for having facilitated leaders of Tampa city government, etc., to go. That seems like a vindictive action rather than a policy action, but nonetheless it's been unresolved. There's also people who have horror stories. There was a time we thought if you went through by plane back to the U.S. that you would be detected and get into trouble, but if you drove on the back country roads into Vermont or Michigan or something, you wouldn't be a problem. So that might still, now the sophisticated users of the travel restrictions are at airports, and they pretty much know that there's not much to be done. I'm talking about the customs agents, etc. The people who have the little country road crossing vary widely. So they used to be, a lot of them, very nice and cool, and now you have some, and have throughout had some who think this is the terrorist capture of the decade, and they shake people down and put them in rooms and keep them for 3 hours, and unless you sign this, you can't get out. And I've had a call like that in the last 2 weeks. So that's not enforcement, it's harassment, I guess, but somebody thinks they're enforcing some law somewhere.
Yep.
But generally speaking, the actual enforcement comes out of OFAC in D.C., or in one case that I cited, out of Miami. And to my knowledge, there is, unless you're also charged with being an unlicensed TSP, travel service provider, or some other criminal indictment, and they're going to add this on. Otherwise, there's no enforcement, I think, with those exceptions, which are important.
So, Bob, can you reiterate what's going to happen to the charter agencies now that they're going to be U.S. airlines doing direct flights? I think you mentioned it in your presentation, but maybe you want to explain that.
I can't speak on behalf of anyone but Mar Azul in terms of the charter companies. There are about 8 of them that do charter flights to Cuba. From Mar Azul's perspective, what we are doing is, one of the divisions of Mar Azul is a charter division. My division up here in New Jersey, we do the land arrangements for groups going to Cuba. And we use any and all means to get groups there, or individuals. So we will be switching groups to the commercial flights wherever that is less expensive, more convenient, whatever. There will still be some groups that want to use a charter flight, or the charters will provide supplementary service to the commercial flights, which the commercial flights are not providing enough flights to go to one another city, or not enough to Havana, or a group wants a plane going down at a particular time. So we will be continuing to do charter flights, but we will also be using the commercial flights. This will be a process that happens somewhere over the period of time between, I think, September and maybe February of next year, that there will be a conversion over to the commercial flights. How many end up flying? That will also be worked out in the real world. American is advertising a daily charter flight from Charlotte. I don't know who's going on that plane. I can't figure it out. There will be 3 daily flights projected from New York City to Havana. Right now, there's flights twice a week, and it's not always full. So I don't know where those people are coming from either. And if they did fill all those planes, as I mentioned before, I don't know where they're going to stay in Cuba. So there's a lot of things that are happening over these next few months that we're just going to have to, it'll come out in the wash, basically.
Bob, on the other hand, there's no direct flights from Chicago to Havana.
There's what?
Frontier is to Santiago, which is nice. I think it's Frontier. But there's something wrong with that picture.
Yes, I agree. You're right.
So real briefly, this is a very complicated question. Actually, 2 questions that are similar. One is what does the solidarity movement with Cuba and the United States need to do in this new stage? And do you think after the elections, regardless who wins, the solidarity movement needs to change directions in terms of the work that needs to be done? Briefly.
Well, just a comment or two. So one thing certainly is to educate people that the economic blockade of Cuba is still, I would say, 90-95% in place. And we've given examples how that relates to travel. I think Obama has done most of what the president can do on travel. Congress would need to do the rest. I think that's not at all true for trade, and I'd be happy to give examples, but that's not the topic, and we're out of time. In terms of the restrictive, privatized-oriented allowance of trade with Cuba, as opposed to generally allowing trade with Cuba. That's my only thought at the moment.
But I agree completely with Art in terms of what he said, his assessment of both what the president has done with travel and what he could do but hasn't done about the embargo as a whole. I would just say in terms of the solidarity movement that after the elections, I think it's more important than ever that the solidarity movement meet and figure out how to move forward based, of course, on the reality of who's been elected, what the Congress is looking like, whoever the president is. But the need for the solidarity movement goes on, particularly after the next elections, and with the opening up with tens of thousands of people going to Cuba. What does it mean to be in solidarity with Cuba? How can we both end the embargo, end all the travel restrictions, and learn something from people who travel to the island, who can exchange with Cubans much more freely. Both Cubans coming up to this country and us going down there. They've had this revolution. They have a different point of view on a whole number of different topics that we think would be fantastic if people were exposed to. And so I think I agree with the assessment that it'll change, but the importance of it is no less than it's ever been.
Thank you so much to both of our presenters, Bob and Art. I want to run through a few slides at the end. It answers the final question, which is how to get involved. I don't see the screen, so I'm going to read off the slides. Hopefully we've got them up on the screen. One is the IFCO Cuba Caravan. It's going on now. There's a website up on the screen, the Venceremos Brigade. Friday, July 15th, they are doing a send-off at $11.99. Saturday, July 23rd, they're going to head to Cuba, return August 8th in Buffalo, crossing the bridge, where there will be a joint rally and press conference between the VB and the Pastors for Peace. There is a solidarity movement that encompasses the whole hemisphere, from the tip of South America to the tip of North America and all those wonderful islands in the Caribbean. And there's going to be a solidarity conference in the Dominican Republic, July 28th to 30th. We're going to send all the slides to people, so you don't have to write it down. July 30th, young Cubans are going to be boxing on the bridge. Happy birthday, Fidel, August 13th and beyond. The NNOC has things that you can use to build meetings. The new video, All Guantanamo is Ours. City Council resolutions, can your city council join them? The National Network on Cuba conference, November 19th and 20th. Go to nnOC.info, more information there. And thank you to the member organizations, Alliance for Global Justice that helped us with this, InterOccupy for use of their platform, Desiree Deloach who helped with the questions, technicians Elaine and Daniela, the Cuban Institute for Friendship with the People, presenters Art and Bob, Bill Hackwell for the photos of Art and Cheryl, you for participating and helping to make these first steps toward new media better. Your comments are needed and welcome. Thank you very much for participating.
Thank you all.
Thank you for inviting us.